have ever wanted something so badly that you were willing to work hard, to do whatever it took to get it? Beg, borrow, steal. This is church, right? We didn't steal. But we begged and we borrowed, and maybe we stole, and we finally got what we wanted, only to be disappointed. Anybody ever? Julie and I. Okay, Norman. There's 3 of us that have done that, okay? I suspect that I'm preaching to the 3 of us this morning. But, yeah, I know that that's true in all of our lives. I was thinking about that in several different categories. I was thinking about that in light of things. You know, we watch advertisements, or we watch other people and we see what they have, and we see what they seem to enjoy, and we just have to get it. You know, and we do whatever it takes, because if I can only have that, you know, then everything will be great. And so we end up getting it, only to be let down, only to be disappointed. I was thinking about that in light of relationships. I mean, how many have done that? Don't raise your hand. How many have done that in relationships in our lives? In our teen group on Sunday night, one of the things that we're talking about this next couple of weeks is dating. And we've been talking about that in light of dating. You know, how many times does a young lady or a young man, it could be, you know, either way, but a young lady, how many times does she see a young man and think, you know, he is just the one that I need in my life? You know, if I could just, you know, date and eventually marry that young man, man, wouldn't that just be wonderful? And so she pursues him, or he pursues her relentlessly, and finally a relationship develops, and you know, only to get together and be disappointed because it wasn't what we thought it was going to be. There's a lot of work and a lot of effort, and we get something only to be let down. How about a job or a career? You know, how many people pursue a job, pursue a career, give everything they have to get training and maybe some type of experience, and only to find themselves in that career and to realize that's not what I wanted at all. It's not what I thought it was going to be. It's not what it looked like it was going to be. How about churches? I was thinking about that in light of pastors. And I could tell horror stories over the years of different churches that have pursued a particular man to be in the pastorate, only to have him get into the pastorate and to just be a horror story. You know, one negative thing after another. And yet that was the man they wanted. That was the man that they were sure that would just be a perfect fit in the church. Again, only to find that it was a horror story. It wasn't what they thought it was going to be. In our road trip through the Bible, we've been following in the Old Testament the children of Israel. And we've been following their leadership, or their path out of Egypt in slavery, through the years of wandering in the wilderness, and then ultimately under the leadership of Joshua, going into the Promised Land and experiencing everything that God wanted. And I thought, you know, the children of Israel, we've seen under the leadership of Moses. We've seen under the leadership of Joshua. Last week in our story of the book of Ruth, we saw the children of Israel under the various judges that God rose up to deliver them in their time of need. They were under a variety of leadership. As we're reading here in 1 Samuel, we know from the context of Samuel that they were under the leadership of a man named Eli. And then they were under the leadership of a man named Samuel. And so, you know, every one of them in some way led Israel. But there was a difference between their leadership and that of a king. Samuel and Eli and the judges and ultimately Joshua and Moses were not kings. They were not presidents. They didn't lead in that sense. They led as one that directly answered to God and then led the people representing God to the people. That's how they led. So ultimately, during all of that time, there may have been a figurehead that was a leader, but ultimately they were under the leadership of God. Ultimately, God led them. And the leadership that Israel had under God worked very well. And when the people followed God's direction, they experienced God's blessing. And God had promised that to them. As they followed the leadership, in this case of Samuel, or of Eli before that, or of the judges, every time time they followed that man's leadership as God directed, God blessed them as a nation. God was good to them. And yet every time they walked away from that leadership, they walked away from God. And when they walked away from God, they experienced God's judgment on them in a variety of ways. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, the people come together. And in verse 5, they come together and they come to Samuel and they demand a king. They come to Samuel and they say, okay, here's the situation. We want a king. We don't want your leadership. We don't want Eli's. We don't want that kind of leadership anymore. We want something different. We want a king. And they shared a couple of reasons why they wanted a king. First of all, Samuel, the prophet of God who was leading them now, was getting old. And as they looked at Samuel, it seems that they had great respect for Samuel, but Samuel's sons were not nice guys. We see at the end of the first couple of verses there, I guess it's in verse 3, it says, "Yet Samuel's sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after gain. They took bribes and they perverted justice." Now Samuel, as far as I know, was a godly man. Samuel talked with God. Samuel led the people when there were judgments that had to be made. Samuel followed the way of justice. He followed what was right in the sight of God. His sons, who were coming up behind him, followed whoever had the biggest wallet, whoever was willing to make the biggest donations. And if you paid me enough, then I would pervert the justice to be what you wanted. And so they were following up through, and I have no doubt that as the people looked at Samuel and they realized that he was getting old, they in one sense thought, you know what, his sons are going to follow in his steps, and we don't want them. We don't want them. Rather than trust God's leadership, and rather than trust that God would work out the prophets and the priests, and God would lead them in the right direction, rather than trust that, they said, you know what, we need to take matters into our own hands here. And we need to make sure that these guys don't follow their dad. We don't want their leadership. Another reason why they wanted a king is in verse 5. They came and they said to Samuel, your sons, or you're getting old, your sons aren't walking in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all other nations. Another reason they wanted a king is they looked at their leadership and they said, you know what? We're the only nation that doesn't have a king. All the other nations around us, they all have kings. They all have someone that they can look to as their leader, and we want a king because everybody else has a king. Now, young people here this morning, have you ever used that excuse with your parents? None of you? Wow, I'm impressed. Yeah, everybody else is. Mom and Dad, everybody else is doing it. And we want to do it. Now, here's the funny thing. We adults are looking around and laughing. Have you ever done that? Not as a kid, as an adult. Have we ever wanted something because all of my friends have it, all of the people I work with do, everybody around me does? Now, we don't say that quite the way the kids do, but we think that. We think that. Other people affect our thinking and our choices more than we would ever admit or realize. And if you don't think that's true, watch advertising on TV. Because they know that. They know that. I mean, how many times is an ad focused around the fact that, you know, you're the only one that's missing out on this because everybody else is driving this kind of car. Everybody else is using this kind of computer equipment. Everybody else has this. And you need not be left out. You need to follow that. They realize that other people affect our decisions and our choices very, very, very often. And sometimes we, like the nation of Israel, pursue after those things and we want them. And we're willing to do whatever it takes to get what we want. And sometimes we get it. And sometimes it's not what it was cracked up to be. Sometimes it's not what it's cracked up to be. The nation of Israel here wants a king. And as they want a king, they're rejecting God. They're pushing God aside because they don't trust Him enough to raise up another leader, and they want to have a king just like everybody else. Now, I think there's an important lesson that we can learn in that. There's an important lesson that we can learn in that. Sometimes God gives us what we want. And sometimes what God gives us because we want it is not what is best for us. And that's exactly what God does here to Israel. If you notice at the end of verse 6, it says, the people said, give us a king, and Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they've not rejected you, they've rejected me from being king over them. Now, obviously I don't know here exactly how Samuel reacted, but I think Samuel said, what? Do what? Give them what? Give them a who? A king? Really? Because Samuel knows that that's not what God wants for Israel. Samuel knows that's not even what's best for Israel. And God says to Samuel, okay, Samuel, they've rejected you. They're not really rejecting you. They're rejecting me. They're pushing me aside. Give them what they want. If they want a king, give them a king. But as you give them a king, I want you to point out something to them. I want you to point out to them what the consequences are going to be. I want you to tell them what a king is going to do. And so Samuel does, and we read the verses a few minutes ago. Samuel says, okay, God said, if you have a king, here are the consequences. Number one, he's going to take your sons and your daughters, and he's going to use them for himself. And I don't know if you noticed before, I tried to emphasize it, but I missed some of them. How many times from verse 10 on, Samuel uses the word his. He's going to take your sons and your daughters for his service. He's going to take these things for himself. The king is going to focus on him. He's going to focus on himself and what he needs. And he's going to come to you, those that are part of his kingdom, and he's going to get what he needs from you. And he's going to start with your sons and your daughters. Because if he is king, he needs people to serve him. He needs people to cook for him. He needs people to wash his clothes. He needs people to meet his needs. He needs people to run his army. He needs people to do whatever it is that he needs. And he's going to take them from your sons and your daughters. He's going to take your daughters to serve in his court. He's going to take a tax of your crops and your flocks and all of your things. You grow crops, you raise a flock, you have a herd. He's going to take a percentage of that. And he has a right to that. He's your king. And you need to support him. And so he's going to tax you. He's also going to take not only your sons and your daughters, he's going to take some of those that are serving you. And he's going to take some of them and he's going to put them in his court. And they're going to serve him. And so Samuel says to the people, God will give you what you want. But there's consequences. And are you willing to pay the consequences? And the people said, what? We don't care what the king's going to do. We want a king. We want to be like everybody else. They demanded a king anyway. And so God said, okay, to Samuel, if they want a king, give them a king. Now, let me ask this. How many times have we ever pursued something in our lives, whether it be another person or whether it be something we wanted or needed or felt like we had to have? And how many times in pursuing that have we ignored warning after warning after warning after warning? Maybe from our parents, maybe from our friends, maybe from those in our church, maybe just the warning of the Holy Spirit speaking to our hearts and our lives. And how many times have we just kept pushing that aside and pushing that aside and pushing it aside because I really want this. And if I could just have this. And all of a sudden we got what we wanted. And the consequences were terrible. They were awful. Well, the children of Israel are doing that. God is warning them. God is not just giving them what they want without warning. God said, this is what's going to happen. And the people said, we don't care. We want a king anyway. Give us a king. And so God gave them exactly what they wanted. In verses 1 and 2 of chapter 9, there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechorath, the son of Aphiah, a Benjamite, a man of wealth. And he had a son whose name was Saul, a handsome man. And there was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the other people. Now, here's the point in all of that. God is going to give them a king. And God is going to give them a king that if they were going to look themselves at all of the people, they would have chosen Saul. He looked the part of king. It says here that he came from a well-to-do family. He had a fairly impressive history or lineage. And that made him, in a sense, qualified to be king. He also was a handsome man. He was a man that, the people looked at and said, oh, he's a good-looking guy. Just like you guys do to me, I'm sure, but doubtful. But anyway, they looked at him and said, yeah, he's a good-looking guy. We'd be proud to have that man as our king. He looks good. And then, I almost passed this over, but I got thinking about it. One of the qualifications here, he was taller than anybody else. And later on, when Saul is introduced as king in chapter 10, they react, and one of the first things they notice is, wow, look how tall this guy is. Now, is that an important trait to be king? Let me put it in modern perspective. And I don't care which side of the political debate you fall on today. I'm not diving into that on Sunday morning. But the first time the two major candidates, Clinton and Trump, debated a couple of weeks ago, one of the issues that they made is the podium size. Why? Because Trump is so much taller than Hillary that if you, and this isn't my commentary, this is fact. Hillary Clinton was worried that when people looked at the stage, if she was standing behind a podium that was the same size as Trump's, what would that do? People would look at her and say, wow, she's not big enough and tall enough to be president. And so they literally made a podium that was a little smaller so that she didn't look as small standing next to Donald Trump. Is tall a qualification for president? It is if we're looking at candidates. Because one looks like he's in charge. And the bigger they are, the more authoritative they are. I'm not making that up. That's true. And it's interesting that one of the things they pointed out with Saul is he's a tall man. He's head and shoulders above everybody else. And in chapter 10, let's read it real quick. In chapter 10, beginning at verse 23, they're introducing him as king. And in verse 23, they ran and took him from there. And when he stood among the people, he was taller than any of the people from the shoulders upwards. And Samuel said to all the people, do you see him, who the Lord has chosen? There is none like him among all the people. And the people shouted, long live the king. You see, one of the first things they noted is how tall he was. He looked like a king. He looked like a man of authority. And so when he was introduced, the people said, that's the guy. We want him. He's our king. Now we're like everybody else. Things are going to be really good. Things are going to be really good. Well, we don't have time to read all of the scriptures, but things weren't really good. God gave the people what they wanted. But it quickly turned into a nightmare. Because King Saul did exactly what God told him to do. It wasn't like it should have been a surprise. King Saul did exactly what God told him. He took their sons and their daughters. He taxed their goods, their crops. He taxed their money. He taxed everything they had. He built a name for himself. He built an army for himself. He did everything that God said that he would do. And the nation went from being a nation that was blessed by God to being in a nation that was turmoil. Because Saul was so looking out for himself that he led the people away from God. And it wasn't long before God looked at Saul and said, you know what? That man's family will never be king. I have rejected Saul. I have cut him off. And Saul was rejected by God, and in a sense, he was rejected by the people as well. God gave them what they wanted. They ignored the warnings of God, got what they wanted, and realized that he is not the one that needed to be king. Realized that he was only one that looked like what they wanted as king. So we skip over to 1 Samuel chapter 16. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, God is going to now work to give them another king. And the Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul? Since I have rejected him from being king over Israel. Fill your horn with oil and go, and I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite. For I have provided myself a king among his sons." God says now, Samuel, I've rejected Saul. He's not to be king much longer. You need to go to the family of Jesse. And out of the family of Jesse, I have chosen somebody else that I want to be king. And I want you to go, and I will show you who this future king will be. And I want you to anoint him with oil. And Saul says, rightly so, there's a problem here. If I go to anoint somebody king, what's Saul going to think about that? Saul's not happy with that. And so God says, okay, you're the priest. You're the prophet, I should say. Go and make a sacrifice. And have Jesse's family come to the sacrifice. And as they come to the sacrifice, I'll reveal to you who the next king is going to be. And so to make a long story short, Samuel goes. He calls the family of Jesse, and Jesse and his family are nervous because the prophet of God has come to town and requested that they come to the sacrifice. Uh-oh. What did we do? And so he does, and Jesse and his family come together. And as they are sacrificing, each of the sons comes before Samuel. And the first son who came before Samuel was a man named Eliab, E-L-I-A-B. And Eliab walked before Samuel, and Samuel said, "Surely this is the guy." He's handsome. He's tall. He's got to be the one that's going to be king. Got to be. And God said to Samuel, not him. Not him. You're looking at his outward appearance. I'm looking at his heart. You got somebody king that on the outside looks like a king. I want somebody whose heart is right. I want somebody whose heart is sensitive and willing to be obedient to me as God. You look on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. Saul looked the part of king, yet his heart was far off. Now God would choose a king whose heart was right with God. And I thought, there's another lesson in that for us to learn as well. Because we like to look at people from the outward appearance. In part because that's all we can physically see. We can't see beyond the physical appearance. But so often we are content to make judgments of people based on simply what we see, with no desire to see any deeper. And we make judgments. We're all guilty of that. And yet we need to be sensitive in our own lives to stop and not just to look at people on the outside and make judgments about who they are and what they are like and maybe even who they are spiritually. We need to look beyond that. We need to see deeper than that. And we need to realize that so often people on the outside are nowhere near who they really are. And there's a lesson that God is teaching Samuel here. And so all of the sons of Jesse come before Samuel, and as everyone walks through, God says, nope, nope, not him, not him. And pretty soon there's none left. And so I'm sure Samuel is confused, and he looks at Jesse and he says, don't you have any more sons? Is there anybody else? And he says, well, this is my paraphrase, obviously. Well, there is one more. Our youngest son, David, is out in the field. He's a shepherd, and he's watching our sheep. Now, many have made a point that, why wasn't David there? They didn't think he was worthy. I'm not sure I buy any of that. I think all of this was set up fairly quickly. watching the sheep. And it was, it all was set up. I mean, Jesse didn't plan on Samuel coming and offering sacrifices. He didn't plan on Samuel saying, Jesse, bring your family and come to the sacrifice. I'm not sure that David was in the field because he was forgotten. I think David was in the field because that was his job. And it was just set up too quickly for David to be brought home and cleaned up and brought to this sacrifice. David is faithfully watching sheep. And so as soon as Jesse said, you know what, I do have another son, he's out in the field, Samuel said, okay, stop the show. You need to get David here right now. And nothing is going to happen until David gets here. And so they send for David, and David is brought before Samuel, and he's described here. Notice he's not described as tall. He's described as being ruddy. Now, there's all kinds of thoughts as to what that means. Literally, it means red. Now, whether he was redhead, whether he was sunburned from being out watching the sheep, I really have no idea. It doesn't say. Most commentators, though, believe it refers to a healthy appearance and also a youthful appearance. He was young. He was healthy. He was also described as having beautiful eyes. It's amazing. Must be a woman who's writing this, because women tend to notice that, right? I don't know that, but he's described as having beautiful eyes and handsome. A handsome young man. Now, contrast that with his brothers. I should say a little more. Contrast how he must have looked with his brothers. Because his brothers got cleaned up. They knew that they were coming to the sacrifice with Samuel. David was rushed in from the field. I've never been a shepherd, but I'm guessing that they didn't take showers and use soap on a regular basis. I'm guessing that he didn't wash his clothes every day. I'm guessing, and this is just a wild guess, that he stunk. And so, here's his brothers, nicely dressed, tall, handsome, experienced. Here's David, fresh from the sheep field. Disheveled. Good one. Disheveled. He doesn't look like a king. He doesn't even look like a leader. He looks like a little boy. And as he comes in, God says to Samuel, that's the guy. He's the king. And I don't know how much David and his family understood at that point. I don't know. But Samuel anointed him. And the anointing represented, whether David knew it or not, it represented he is the man that God chose to be the next king. Now, he didn't become king right away. There was a time period there. But he was chosen by God to be the next king. And you know, he was chosen by God to be the next king because God looked at his heart. And God saw that his heart was right. Saul was given to Israel because he looked the part. David was chosen by God because he had a heart that was right with God. Now, we just have a few minutes left. What was David's heart like? What was his heart like? What did God see in the heart of David that caused him to say, I want him to be the next king? A couple of things. Number one, and these are all important to us as well. David had a heart of dependence on God. David depended on God. Saul, and again, we just summarized Saul's life, but if you know much about Saul's reign as king, Saul depended on Saul. And God told Saul, here's what I want you to do, and I want you to wait for me. Saul said, I can't wait that long, I'll do it myself. Saul depended on Saul. David was a young man that depended on God. David wrote in Psalm 62, speaking of God, He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I will not be shaken. On God rests my salvation and my glory. My mighty rock, my refuge is God. I trust Him at all times. O people, pour out your heart before God. He is a refuge for us. You know, one of the most famous accounts of David in Scripture is in 1 Samuel chapter 17 with his fighting Goliath. And we see even in that account that David had a heart that trusted God. A heart that was dependent on God. And beginning in verse 43, you know, young David walks walks in before the Philistine giant. David is armed with a slingshot and rocks. The giant is armed with armor and a sword and a helmet. And the Philistine, the giant, said to David, "Am I a dog? You come to me with sticks?" The Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air, to the beasts of the field." David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin." But he said, "I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel that you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand. I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I'll give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And today the whole earth will know that there's a God in Israel." David had a heart of dependence on God. He said, "I don't care what the enemy says. I know what God says. And I will trust my God." David also had a heart that was obedient to God. Unlike Saul, who did what was right in his own eyes. Saul did what was right in his own eyes and then tried to justify it. "Well, I know I didn't do what God said, but..." And God rejected him. In Psalm 40, verse 8, David said, "I delight to do your will, O God. Your law is written in my heart." David strove to have a heart that was obedient to God. David also had a heart of servitude. David had a heart that just wanted to serve God. A heart that was sensitive to God. In Psalm 89 and verse 20, the Lord said, "I have found David my servant." The Lord called David a servant. He had a heart of servitude. And then finally, he had a heart of integrity. He had a heart of integrity. Integrity, as I'm sure you know, is being and acting the same, whether people are watching or whether they're not watching. A person of integrity acts the same at home when nobody's there as he does in church when everybody's watching him. And David had a heart of integrity. David was far from perfect. David was far from perfect. And we'll see next week that David was not a perfect individual. He sinned, he struggled, he fell, and when he fell hard. But at the same time, when he made mistakes, or I should say when he sinned against God, because he had a heart of integrity, he was convicted of his sin. Rather than trying to justify it and explain it away and say, "Well, it was okay because..." When God confronted him with his sin, David was broken. And David admitted his sin, repented of his sin, and tried to turn away from that sin. Because he was a man of integrity. In Psalm 78, it says that God chose David to be his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds. From following the nursing ewes, he brought him to the shepherd Jacob, or brought him to shepherd his people Israel. With an upright heart, David shepherded them and guided them with a skillful hand. David had a heart of integrity. His heart was right with God. Now, this morning, two things. Number one, how do we look at those around us this morning? It's way too easy to look at people around us and make judgments based on what the appearance is. God doesn't see our appearance, and thank God that He doesn't see our appearance. He sees us for who we really are. And we need to try to begin to look at people for who they really are. Where their heart is, what their heart is like, who they are on the inside. We need to make a habit of praying that God would enable us to see people differently than just who they are on the outside. The second thing this morning is, how is our heart this morning? You know, we have a heart. Do we have a heart that is a heart of integrity the way David did? Do we have a heart of servitude? Do we have a heart of obedience? Do we have a heart that is striving to put God first and to please God in the things that we do? Do we have a heart that just simply says, I trust God? And because I trust God, I'm going to walk and live in obedience to Him. It's that type of person that God chooses to use in His work and in His ministry. Well, let's take a moment and bow for prayer. Father, I do thank You this morning for Your word. thank you for the example of David as king. And he certainly was a man that was not always doing exactly the right thing, but he was a man that had a heart that was seeking you, and a heart that was striving to serve and to be obedient. And I pray that those same qualities would be true in our hearts and our lives. And Lord, I pray that we would be very careful at how we judge those around us. Lord, those that are sitting around us this morning, we know what things appear to be, but many times we really don't know what is going on in their hearts and their lives. Lord, help us to be sensitive to see people the way you see them. And Lord, I pray that as those things are true in our lives, that Lord, you would use us the way that you used David in so many great ways. We thank you in Jesus' name.